everyone and welcome. Thank you all for joining us this late summer August evening here at the Austrian Embassy. My name is Finja Draxler and I'm the new Director of the Press and Information Service here. It is my pleasure to welcome you here to tonight's event with Dr. Jonathan Simpson, who will discuss his new book titled The Habsburg Monarchy and the American Revolution. There's a large literature on the American Revolution, but Dr. Singerton's book fills an important gap. The book is the first account to analyze the impact of the American Revolution in the Habsburg lands in full. As Dr. Singerton writes in his introduction, this book is about the meaning of the American Revolution for the Habsburg monarchy and at the same time, the Habsburg moment in the American Revolution. Before we get started, a quick word about the format of tonight's program. First, Dr. Singerton will present his book. We will then open the floor to the audience for questions. After the talk and Q&A, we would like to invite you all for a glass of Austrian wine. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jonathan Simpson. He's a lecturer and research fellow at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Previously, he was a fellow at the Institute of Habsburg Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences in Vienna. He received his PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh in 2018 and was awarded the university's Jeremiah Dalziel Prize in British History. With that, I'm delighted to give the floor to Dr. Jonathan Simpson.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you very much for the welcome here this evening to the Austrian Embassy, to such an exquisite venue and to a wonderful audience. So thank you, Hannes Richter, for organising this event. Thank you for the words of introduction. And most of all, thank you all for being here tonight on this wonderful Midsummer's Eve. I'm very grateful to see you all and very happy to answer questions at the end of today's talk. So, as explained, the talk today focuses on my book that has just come out in the last year, The American Revolution and the Habsburg Monarchy. So I will be discussing the results of the book, the highlights of the book, if you will, and what it means for not only Habsburg history, but also the history of the American Revolution as well. So as you can see, I've just listed the table of contents as well as the front page of the book. It goes without saying that a book that is around 390 pages cannot be condensed into a 5-hour lecture tonight without getting to go. But I'm going to talk for the next 40 minutes about the main parts of the book, the main highlights of the book. So the book itself goes from the, say, 1760s until the end of the revolutionary period, and a bit beyond into the 1790s and touching upon the 19th century. In today's talk then I'm going to focus on really that core period, looking at 3 particular themes. Those themes are diplomacy, commerce and ideas. So I'm going to use those as sort of coat hooks for the talk as we go through the very exciting, dynamic relationship between Austria and the American Revolution. So first of all, and to begin with, because I often get asked this at talks and in general, where or what was the Habsburg monarchy? And if to anybody who has come tonight expecting the Spanish Habsburgs and me to talk about inbreeding, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, because instead we're going to talk about the Austrian Habsburgs. So I begin then first of all with maps are also included in the book, to orientate ourselves a bit spatially. So for those of you who know your history already, you'll be familiar with this space. For those of you who are aware of Austria-Hungary in the 19th century, it's broadly the same, but there are a few crucial differences. Most of all the Austrian Netherlands, which is nowadays Belgium, as well as parts of Italy, so Milan and Mantua. And in this case, I also include Tuscany, which was not properly part of the Habsburg monarchy. It was ruled over by the emperor's younger brother under terms of Secegenta. But in the book, I explain why this had a rather influential role, and it's part of this story as well. But for tonight, I will leave out most of these discussions. So again, it's important to remember when we look at the Habsburg monarchy and not to underestimate them. As so often is the case, they are left out of histories of the American Revolution. They are sidelined to some degree in histories of the Atlantic world or the world beyond Europe. And there's not really much cause for this. They are the third largest state in Europe in terms of population, just behind Russia and France, with 21 million people. And for context, Great Britain at that time had around 18 million people, and the colonies had a couple of million people. So it's a large state with a large amount of people and a very common place in Europe. It has one of the largest standing armies at the time of the American Revolution, and a few decades later, the height of the Napoleonic Wars, this was the country with the largest army on the planet, fielding nearly 500,000 men. So as a military power as well, it is a significant state. And diplomatically, culturally, of course, it goes without saying that Austria and the Habsburg monarchy has played an oversized role in those areas. Diplomatically speaking, of course, the Habsburg emperors were the heads of the Holy Roman Empire as well. And this was also a factor then for the American Revolution and the American revolutionaries. So, turning to my first theme for tonight, diplomacy, and I thought it's important to begin with diplomacy since we are in the Austrian embassy, and it is a very crucial part of this early relationship. I'm going to discuss now the role of diplomacy, the first beginnings of diplomacy between the Habsburg monarchy, and perhaps two very important case studies within that. I note as I came onto the stage that the embassy has assigned this in since 1838, and I hope in some ways to prove how it's actually not since 1838, but rather 50 years before that in 1778. And the reason why is because the real official sort of diplomatic beginnings for Austria and America start with this man here, William Lee. He is also the most unfortunate diplomat you've never heard of. He is a descendant of the famous Lee dynasty in Virginia. He is by trade a merchant who is settled in London, and on the eve of the revolution finds himself hounded out of London and finds himself working as a sort of low-level commercial recruiter in Paris for the Americans. He gets his position then as a diplomat through his family's influence, notably Richard Henry Lee, the person who first proposed American independence, who gets him the job then as the diplomat in charge of the courts of Berlin and Vienna. He is the American revolutionaries' envoy to both Vienna and Berlin. And again, he was not a wise choice for this in many ways. And as one contemporary said, neither chance nor accident could ever have named William Lee commissioner to the first court in Europe, in Vienna, or indeed to any court in the world. And there was good reason to doubt Lee's suitability as a diplomat. He spoke almost no French, or no coherent French, and he spoke not a word of German. So it did not set him up very well when he arrived in Vienna in May of 1778. Now, a little bit of context about Lee's mission in 1778 to Vienna. First of all, from the American perspective, it made sense to include the Habsburgs as one of their targets among the European courts. The Habsburgs, as I said, were one of the largest powers. They were militarily very important, and that the Americans hoped and possibly believed they could bring the Habsburgs onto their side. At this time, the Habsburgs were allies of France, the Americans allied from 1778, so it seemed a logical conclusion that the Habsburgs may well support the war. So they had three main aims with Lee's mission. First of all, to use the position of the Holy Roman Emperor to stop the flow of Hessian troops. Second of all, to procure military supplies, possibly contracts for military supplies from the Habsburg lands. And thirdly, to cultivate favour and friendship, possibly leading to a treaty of recognition or treaty of amity in commerce. So those are the three aims in Lee's mission. He failed horribly in all three of these. And one of the main reasons he failed horribly, apart from his linguistic deficiencies, was that he was hosted by the French ambassador. I can say this with confidence, being in the Austrian embassy. So the French ambassador was in charge of presenting Lee at court, and the Habsburgs, for their part, did not want to meet Lee at all. So weeks before he had arrived, he was sort of shut out of court already, thanks to the British, who did not want an American rebel, as they saw it, being presented at court and accepted by the Habsburgs. And from the French perspective, it was a useful mission where they could possibly get their ally to now side with them in the war. So you have to remember, at the beginning of the war, France is the only power to really recognize America and support America. So if they get more people on board, this would be great for them as well. And Bertoff, who is the French ambassador, later the last Prime Minister of France, who is the person again in charge of presenting Lee at court, chaperoning the court, does a horrible job. The very first meeting where Lee is presented at court, he enters as the State Chancellor is entertaining British guests and the British ambassador. So you can imagine how difficult and awkward that meeting was. The same thing happens, just by pure misfortune, a few days later when he tries to meet the Vice Chancellor of the Habsburg monarchy. And by day 3 or day 4, it is effectively over diplomatically. Maria Theresa did not want to meet him at all. Now, as much as I say that he failed diplomatically, he was very successful in a propaganda war. So much so that the British ambassador, by the end of these stays, taking his delegation to St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna to pray for the British cause because he thought it was so damaged by his visit. Lee became a celebrity overnight because he was someone who had caused the stir at court, someone who had disrupted court, and so all of the people who owned salons and had organised dinners wanted Lee to come to their dinners and wanted to know something about this exotic, curious Virginian. So in part Lee failed diplomatically, but he helped to galvanise and helped to inspire more sympathy for the American cause in Vienna in 1778. And for that he should also be remembered. Moving a bit forward in time now to the end of the American Revolution, to 1783, where it is apparent that America is a sovereign nation, a new republic, an independent country that's now sanctified by the Peace of Paris that was signed at the beginning of that year. One of the major things that becomes apparent to European powers is that this new country has a lot of trade to offer. Throughout the war, of course, the colonies had freed themselves from the British monopoly, and things like tobacco, rum, and sugar, and indigo, these were all commodities that European markets wanted. So there's a great scramble at the end of the American Revolution, the end of the Revolutionary War, for American commerce, and the Habsburgs, believe it or not, were right in the thick of this as well. So this person behind me, Frederick, Eugene, Debay, and Bertoff, was the first official representative of the Habsburg monarchy in the United States. He was sent over on the aptly named frigate, the George Washington, and he arrived in Philadelphia in September of 1783. He was among some of the earliest then representatives from the other European countries to arrive. And he was sent there on a 5-year mission. Now, it's important to say a little word about his position exactly, because he was not a full ambassador, but rather a commercial advisor to the emperor. And this was a particularly unique post because they wanted to focus on commerce, and Balin's initial plans and initial tasks in America were to support the commerce between both the Habsburg lands and the United States. So he was to help merchants, to represent them if they had legal trouble, he was to scout out new plans and opportunities, and he was to try and prepare and help to guide the Americans towards entering a treaty of commerce with the Habsburg monarchy. Those were his main aims and objectives. And he was rather successful at this. During his time in the American Republic, he filed over 350 reports on American commerce, on American trade, on American society, on American culture, and he filled over 1,600 pages, handwritten pages in these accounts. So he did his due diligence. He was one of the most productive, one of the most diligent representatives of the Europeans in early America. And his reports, if you go to the Viennese archives today and press to see them, are about 6 boxes that are as tall as I am. So there's a significant amount of information that passed from Philadelphia to Vienna in that period. Now, Bacon, as I said, was tasked with procuring a possible treaty by scouting out new opportunities. He did this quite well. He ingratiated himself among the nobles, the notable people of early American society, the presidents of Congress, congressmen, and so on like this. This is evidenced by the sketchbook that his son left behind in the family archive, which contains this very nice portrait of George Washington, possibly done from life, probably done from a portrait, if not from life. So they knew Washington, they knew many of the leaders of the early republic. They were accepted really as a sort of diplomatic representation. Now, again, I said one of his main objectives was to scout out new opportunities, and one of the things that excited him most was finding out new opportunities for Habsburg trade. And one of the greatest opportunities he felt was the Native American nations along the borders of the US. In the 1780s, it's important to remember that the American experiment was not a done deal, and it was not something that Europeans thought of very highly. America was going through convulsions in terms of rebellions or possible coups, and Bailyn was very sensitive to this. They were sensitive to the fact that Americans used paper money, not coin, for example. So there was a lot of disbelief in the American economy of the 1780s, despite the attraction of new trade with America. So Bailyn, by contrast, thought that direct trade between the Habsburg lands and Native American lands might offer a better solution to this. And so for that reason, in 1785, he travels to New York, he takes his son with him, and they meet with several representatives of the United Nations from upper state New York nowadays to discuss a possible trade deal. And he sends then later another trade ambassador who survived at that time from Bohemia to go and travel to the United Lands to possibly trade or instigate trade with them directly. So this again was a period not just of new connections forged between the United States and North America and the Habsburg lands, but also new connections forged with Native America during this age as well. And Bailyn's ideas and reports were highly influential. As you see behind me, this is a portrait of one of the Seminole leaders from earlier in the century. Bailyn included this in his reports with the lines that they are much like us, that the king title here is much like our title of an emperor. Their legal system, their governmental system is similar to ours and similar to the Holy Roman Empire. So there was an understanding and appreciation from Bailyn's side, and these ideas were also well received in both Vienna, where his reports ended up, as well as the court in Brussels, where his reports were sent to. So again, I mentioned how the interest was there post-war, but I haven't quite explained how that arose in terms of commerce. So in this part now, I'm going to discuss the trade links, the commercial links between both the Habsburg lands and the North American colonies, both during and after the war. And to discuss the commerce, one of the most important places to know about and to focus upon is Ostend in the Austrian Netherlands. Now, again, some people ask me where Ostend is. It is here on the coast of the Austrian Netherlands, next to Newport near Bruges. And one of the most important things to recognize about Ostend in this time is it's a relatively up-and-coming port. In centuries before the American Revolution, the main port in the Austrian Netherlands was Antwerp. It was the London of its day before the Dutch got jealous and closed the main river that led to Antwerp from the sea and inland. And this precipitated the fall of Antwerp and the rise of Amsterdam in the time before London became the leading economic capital of Europe. And so in the Austrian Netherlands, without Antwerp, trade started to shift then towards the other ports along the coast, namely to Newport and to Ostend, which you see on the map. They did this then, this redirection, through a series of canal projects, building canals to change the economic compass of the Austrian Netherlands from north to south, to east to west, to west to east. So from inland, from the German parts into the coastline. Now, one of the other important things to recognize about the Austrian Netherlands during this time is it is bisected by the small country in between, the Prince-Bishopric of Liège. Now, the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, in the lighter grey on the map there, is important because that is one of the major gun manufacturing places of Europe at the time of the American Revolution. They exported at that time around 250,000 guns per annum. They make cannons, they make gunpowder. And this, if you're fighting as Americans who are against the superpower of its day, you need guns, you need weapons to do that. Especially when the British have destroyed the gunpowder mills or captured those first early in the war. So Americans knew very much that they would get their weaponry from places like Liège and then later from their allies in France. But as the war went on, all belligerents sought out these Liègeois guns to help fight their war and to help sustain the war effort. And as the mayor of Liège wrote in 1776, our traders, great and small, are giving work to our men. We see nothing but crates of guns in the streets. And indeed, over the course of the American Revolutionary War, from 1776 to 1783, this trade moved then towards Ostend as the safest place of export. So the safest place to ship these weapons then to the foreign countries, to Great Britain, France, to the colonies, and so on. And Ostend shipped in total around £2 million in terms of weight, £2 million of weaponry during this period. So it is an enormous amount of weaponry that comes out of Liège to support not only the American cause but the other fighters in the American Revolution. And as time goes on, this gets more and more the case, because when France joins the war, the trade route to the south gets blocked from many other countries. And when the Dutch joined the war in 1780 against Britain, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, then the northern route is blocked. So essentially, Ostend after 1780 becomes the only way to ship these guns safely out of the country. And people in Ostend start to take advantage of this. They sell their company flag or the neutral Habsburg flag, the naval flag, to foreign firms. They use many nefarious ways to mask their ships as Habsburg ships. In fact, they're still owned or run by British crews or by French crews and Dutch crews, because if you had a Habsburg flag on your ship, you would not be attacked. You were neutral, technically. So you had a greater chance of surviving and of taking your cargo to where it needed to get to be. And so for that reason, Ostend's trade, and by extension the economy in the Austrian Netherlands and in Vienna, explodes. From an average of around 480 ships per year entering that harbour at Ostend, over 3,000 per annum reached Ostend in 1780 to 1783. So a total of 9,000 ships from around 500 ships per year. It's an extraordinary explosion in terms of volume in Ostend. So big, in fact, that they had to tear down the wall and create an entirely new suburb of the port city to accommodate this. And so this helps them to explain why the Habsburgs were very eager to continue this trade after the American Revolution. Because although many of these foreign traders had returned home, there were new companies, there were new trading lines that had been established between Ostend and the Caribbean and North America, which they wanted to keep going, for obvious reasons, because they wanted to keep earning the money and the taxation from it. Turning to the other port in Habsburg monarchy, again pointed out on the map there, the port of Trieste. Trieste is a very important port city in Habsburg history in general, because in the 18th century it becomes one of the main export hubs and one of the main focuses of reform for the Habsburg rulers. So in a period before the American Revolution, the father of Maria Theresia creates this port as a free port in an effort to stimulate trade, and then in this period the Emperor Joseph II names it as the major port then for the Austrian parts of the Habsburg monarchy to export the goods out of the country. In Trieste, much like in Ostend, people were aware of the possibilities of trading with America, and there were many who were very aware of this right at the beginning of the war. So indeed, one observer in Trieste said at the beginning of the war that the current situation of the English colonies in America seems to meet considerable attention, and more than ever before to have commerce, which has especially made the Dutch and English so rich and respectable. So there's a great awareness at the beginning of the war they should also start to trade directly with the United States. It doesn't quite happen, it takes a lot of time for this to occur, but in 1782 there are already ships that sail then from Trieste directly to the United States, the first one of which is called l'Americano, a very original, imaginative name perhaps, but that was the first direct sailing ship, and then there were several that followed quickly after that. And within a few years, the trade between Trieste, between the major port of the Habsburg monarchy and America, had proven so lucrative that there was a new company that had been founded in town, the Austro-American Trading Company, founded by 4 merchants in 1783, that ran for a number of years and was highly successful bringing this trade to Trieste and to the Habsburg lands. And by this period, the end of the war, 1783, 1785, the United States was the most lucrative market for the Habsburgs outside of the Mediterranean. So they definitely made good advantage of this. I often get asked, what did they trade? What were they willing to trade between, say, Habsburg products and American products? In most cases, it was Bohemian products, textiles from Bohemia were of good quality and very famous during this time. Glassware, especially Bohemian crystal and Bohemian drinking glasses and window panes and these things, those were taken in great volume, around 33% of total. But they also traded metal and metalwares and spices and oriental goods as well. And you can see these in these advertisements in Philadelphia and these newspapers that they were selling goods that come directly from Trieste, for example. And it's worth pointing out as well that during this time there are expeditions to India and to China, that gets a lot of attention by historians of Habsburg monarchy, but the trade to India and China already within the first year of trade, within 1782 and 1783, is worth less than the trade to America. So again, the main point is that the trade with America at the end of the Revolution is highly profitable for the Habsburgs, which explains again their great interest and reason for sending a trade representative there as soon as the war ended. Now, we might question, why did this trade not so much prosper after the war? Why do we not hear then of sort of greater diplomatic ties or great trading ties between the Habsburg lands and between North America? It's quite simple. The man responsible for the end of this great trade is the person there on the left. And I'm sure that one person, Dr. Gabe Wilson, who has written a book about Jefferson and indeed about this portrait, will know this is Thomas Jefferson. This is the third president of the United States during his time as the ambassador in France. Now, Jefferson, along with John Adams, was responsible in the mid-1780s for concluding commercial treaties with many other countries in Europe. They did so quite well. They closed deals with the Prussians, with the Danish, with the Swedish, and so on, and helped to prosper American commerce with these trade deals. But the one country that they did not sign a deal with was Austria. And as Jefferson confessed, in a sense, in a letter written 100 days before his death in 1826, he said that the Austrians became desirous of a treaty with us, and her ambassador pressed it often upon me. But our commerce with her being of no object, I evaded his repeated invitations. So in other words, Jefferson didn't believe in the possibilities of commerce between the Habsburg lands and North America. He didn't think that it would be worth anything. This was not a mindset shared by many Americans at that time, most notably his colleague John Adams. John Adams travelled through parts of the Habsburg monarchy, he had travelled through the Austrian Netherlands. He had seen for himself the great impetus to trade between the merchants in the Austrian Netherlands and North America, and he fully believed in the potential of this as well. Jefferson, by contrast, again, did not. He had a particular view of how America would prosper and with which countries it could prosper, mainly those that were on the Atlantic. Now, this is an established narrative and understood as an established reason for why Jefferson had this aversion to the Habsburgs, but I don't think it fully accounts for that. And in the book, I also argue that Jefferson had a particular view that shaped his position towards the Habsburgs diplomatically about the man on the right, which is the Emperor Joseph II. So Jefferson was very new to Europe at that time. He was not so well connected to the Habsburg lands, unlike his predecessor, Benjamin Franklin, who I'll explain in a minute. And so he didn't have much of an understanding of what was going on in terms of the Habsburgs at this time. He got most of his information from French newspapers or from Dutch newspapers, which were rather anti-Habsburg at that time, given the tensions over Antwerp and the reopening of the river by Antwerp. And so Jefferson developed then the sense that Joseph, as the leader of the Habsburg monarchy, was a rather maverick, untrustable, and perhaps unworthy ally and trading partner. And so it's partly for that reason that Jefferson avoids such a trade deal with the Habsburgs. And by the end of the 1780s, then, without a trade deal, these merchants in Ostend, in Trieste, cannot compete against their other European competitors who have better tariffs and better conditions to trade. So it forces, in a sense, a collapse of this economic relationship. Now, there's a certain level of irony in this as well, which I'd like to explain, and that is that when Jefferson returned to the United States and finished his time as the Secretary of State and resigned to return to Monticello, he embarked upon a building project to build this great house in Virginia, as well as his other house in Poppy Forest. And Jefferson did so with the help of a Bohemian merchant who he used as his source for Bohemian glass. And I mentioned earlier that Bohemian glass was of very good quality, it was highly sought after by Europeans and by Americans, and Jefferson was no different. The window panes in Monticello were originally Bohemian glass, and if you've ever been to Monticello, you go to the dome room at the top and you see, unlike tonight with a lot of rain, if you see a sunny Virginian sky above the cupola there, you will be looking through Bohemian glass. It was the only glass that was strong enough that didn't crack, unlike the Italian glassmakers' glass that could support the size of his dome on top of Monticello. So he relied upon this Bohemian glass to build and complete his projects in Virginia. Now, the reason I said that there was some level of irony in this transaction was that he was paying through the nose for this glass. He was paying a higher price to import this glass because it came from Hamburg, came from Bohemia via Hamburg, via the North German territories. And so the customs and tolls and so on like this to ship that glass to Hamburg and to get it over to Virginia was exceedingly high compared to if it had travelled southwards to Trieste and over to America. So if Jefferson hadn't have undone the possibility of a trade deal between the Habsburgs and America, he might have had a cheaper house to live in. And the same would have gone for the president, because the White House was also composed of Bohemian glass as well as the US Capitol building originally before Minot came back in 1812 and did unspeakable things and burned down the White House. So, moving on now to my last part of tonight's talk, the intellectual spectacle of the American Revolution, the ideas that had erupted from the American Revolution and landed in Europe and awoken many people and inspired many people. This is something I think that is often overlooked because we have this idea of the Habsburgs, perhaps in this kind of being already rather conservative, being typical of that Metternich era police state kind of country. And it wasn't at all the case. There were many people across many social strata in the Habsburg monarchy that were sympathetic to the American cause, that were interested in the American cause. And as one of the great barometers of this is to look at the mail that Benjamin Franklin received. So I'm sure you're all aware of who Benjamin Franklin is and so on. I just want to impress upon you again the point that when Franklin was in Paris throughout the American Revolution and throughout the American Revolutionary War, he is the most famous American. He is by far the sort of figurehead for many Europeans of this war. And so it's useful to see then, based upon the fan mail that he received, what the view of the American Revolution was in Europe and in the Habsburg monarchy at that time. So Franklin received a rather large amount of mail from Habsburg lands, at least the mail that still survives. I've got two diagrams for you to see on the left. One, of course, is showing where that came from, and you can see roughly the outline of the Habsburg monarchy already in that diagram. You can see that it comes from all parts, not just Vienna, for example. It comes from all corners of the Habsburg lands. And then on the bottom, and you can see this in more detail in the book as well, but it is a very continual spread of mail as well, but reaching a peak during the later years of the American Revolution. So Franklin received in total around 250 letters from Habsburg correspondences from nearly 100 different individuals. It's a very rather large amount, and it's the largest amongst the German-speaking lands by far. So in Prussia, for example, Habsburg mail outstripped Prussian mail by almost 5-1. So Franklin and the American Revolution was a very sort of popular subject, let's say, in the Habsburg lands in this case. And the letters that are written are often written sometimes with a request, especially from merchants, but from other people we can really get a sense of what they felt and what they saw in the American Revolution. There are two cavalry officers, for example, two military officers on the military border in southern Hungary who wrote, "We are born in the empire where we still breathe some freedom, but we are burning with desire to spend our days in a country where freedom will make so many happy." And for that they included then an application to go fight the American Revolution. And we see this sort of expression of willingness to help the Americans, willingness to express their sympathy across all levels of society. So we see this from school teachers in St. Pölten, of all places, to Linz, to Salzburg, to even members of the court. So secretaries to Maria Theresia write letters to Franklin expressing their joy at the latest American victories, for example. And one of the great examples of this outpouring of sympathy and excitement about America perhaps comes in the form of Joseph Kaufman, who was the first American-born student at the University of Vienna. He was born in Philadelphia in 1755. He had moved originally from there to the Austrian Netherlands, where he attended a Catholic preparatory school, and then studied medicine at the University of Vienna. He graduated early. By all accounts, he was a brilliant student. He had a bright future ahead of him as a medical doctor, a very good profession at that time. And he was deciding in the year before the American Revolution whether to go to London or to go to Scotland for his future career. He chose instead to go fight the American Revolution because he thought that was his main duty. And he wrote to Franklin, he said, "I should always think of that is the first duty of man to serve his country. Untouched by the present calamities, I wish to honour the most glorious cause in history of the world. So again, Kaufman was so moved that he gave up his opportunities from Vienna, from Europe, to go fight in the American Revolution. And he took with him a band of Viennese brothers to go fight as well. But one of the most important people leading the charge for the American cause in the court of Vienna was the man memorialized in this bust, which is visible in the courtyard of the University of Vienna. He is most notable today, most often remembered as the discoverer of photosynthesis. He is the Dutch-born Dr. Jan Egginghaus. Now, Egginghaus had grown up in the Dutch Republic, and he had met his fame as such in London, where he got to know Benjamin Franklin, just on the eve of his call to Vienna to inoculate the imperial family against smallpox. So Egginghaus is in Vienna then during the early stages of the American Revolution, and he still maintains his friendship with Franklin. And he is aggrieved to learn the negative British propaganda against Franklin, and he seeks to defend Franklin and to spread then the later American cause in Vienna. So we see this in the remarkable amount of essays that he penned, defending the Americans that were spread and widely read at the Viennese court. We see this also in the letters that he translated, that he then passed on to Maria Theresa. And this is a very significant point, is that Franklin had this sort of direct hotline to the Empress Maria Theresa that he had nowhere else practically in Europe. If he wished to see the French king, he had to be asked, or he had to request an audience. But in this case, he could write directly to Maria Theresa via his intermediary in Jan Egginghaus and hope to persuade her of the American cause. Now, the imperial family, namely Maria Theresa and her sons Joseph II and then the later Emperor Leopold, are a very interesting case which I'll also briefly mention today. Maria Theresa, for all parts, was a cautious observer of the American Revolution. She was deeply interested in the course of the American Revolution because she feared for the stability of Europe and peace at the end of her life that reigned over Europe. So she had these interests in it. She corresponded very heavily with Marie Antoinette in Paris to know about what was happening on the French side and on the American side. She also then read these essays written by Franklin from Egginghaus, for example. So she was keenly interested, but she was rather cautious in her old age about the effects of the American Revolution. This contrasted by far the reactions of the two sons, Joseph and Leopold. So Joseph II, who became the sole ruler of the Habsburg monarchy in 1780, was rather different. When he went to visit, as you see depicted in this image here, his sister Marie Antoinette in France, ostensibly to find out why there had not been a French heir to the throne born yet and why they had not conceived a child, Joseph brought with him a list of people that he wanted to meet. And among the top of that list was Benjamin Franklin, of course. So Joseph wanted to meet the great sage of the age, the most famous American revolutionary in Europe at that time. And believe it or not, they did arrange to meet over hot chocolate. So it was arranged by the Tuscan delegation, because it was diplomatically sensitive, of course, for the Holy Roman Emperor to meet this American rebel. So it was arranged covertly between the two of them to have a cup of hot chocolate. Now, what happens is that Franklin turns up, waits an hour, Joseph doesn't show up, Franklin takes his leave. He writes this on the invitation that he received, that I turned up, the Emperor simply didn't show up. A few hours later, Joseph shows up, and he's missed his chance to meet with Franklin. And the reason I wondered why Joseph decided to miss this meeting that he wanted, that he helped to instigate in a sense, it was quite clear then, after I looked in the archives, the British were to blame. The British knew of this meeting, this planned meeting of hot chocolate between the Emperor and Franklin, and they descended upon Joseph that day and effectively stalled him so that he couldn't go to this meeting. Because again, it's too diplomatically sensitive for Franklin to meet with such a great ruler in Europe, especially one that they were trying to turn against the Americans in the war. Now, the case of Leopold, the last person I mentioned in our cover of the imperial family, at that time he was the ruler in his own right of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, the area of Tuscany nowadays in Italy. And during the American Revolution, he was highly intrigued by the ideas of the American Revolution. He began the constitutional project in Tuscany. He wanted to leave behind a legacy where all Tuscans had their rights enshrined in some sort of constitution. And he studied many foreign constitutions as the basis for his own plan for a constitution, as many as 18 different constitutions. But among those constitutions, and this is again during the Revolutionary War, is the Constitution of 1776 of Pennsylvania. And it's quite striking to read his memoirs. You see the first page of his memoirs, his considerations about this constitution, where he writes, and remember this is the son of Maria Theresa, this is a future emperor of the Habsburg lands, he writes, "What I ask is that in order to make a good legal code in all states, even in monarchies, one must begin with the principle posed by the Americans, the principle of equality." And again, this reminds us that you could be a monarchist back at that point. You could be a monarchist and still be supportive of the ideas of the American Revolution. Those were not incompatible at that time before the radical French terror and the French Revolution. And for much the same reason, people across the Habsburg lands were inspired to promote the message of the American Revolution. And I will just finish with this last example then of this great interest and outpouring of appreciation for the American Revolution in the Habsburg lands. Namely, the historian Johan Zinder. Now, Johan Zinder was born in Bohemia. He was a German-speaking Bohemian, but he wrote most of his life in Hungary. The early stages of the revolution, he was prefect in Budapest, and he later moved to Kozice as a professor of universal history. Kozice is nowadays located in eastern Slovakia near the border with Ukraine. And Johan Zinder during this time wanted to write works about the American Revolution, and he used as his source material the newspapers that he could get his hands on. So Dutch newspapers, Hungarian newspapers, Viennese newspapers, and so on. There's only one problem with this source material, namely that often they contradicted each other, or they included different topics of information, or completely different topics of information. And so, like any good historian, he needed proper sources to write a good book. And so, confronted with this problem, he wrote to Benjamin Franklin in 1778 about the issue of identifying truly who Benedict Arnold was. Was he a British soldier? Was he an American soldier? Who was to know? And with some exaggeration, he wrote to Franklin, "He is sometimes made out to be a German of Mainz, sometimes an American of Connecticut, and sometimes a Latz-Scottian monk, and sometimes a Norwegian shopkeeper." So how was Zinder meant to find out who Arnold was? Well, Franklin happily invited him to Paris to talk with him and to provide him with fresh evidence. And so Zinder happily did this in 1778 to 1779, and when he returned, he labored then over several works about the American Revolution. The first one you see here, it's called in German, something like Remarkable Noteworthy Letters and Writings of Some of the Most Famous Generals of America. It was a sort of primary source edition of its day. It included letters from American generals as well as British generals. The British generals come off rather worse compared to the American generals, and that shows again Zinder's early allegiances here, his early sympathies as well. Zinder, as time went on, told Franklin that he was labouring over not just this book, but other works as well. Two works, in fact, about the American Revolution and the history of the American Revolution. Now, these works really constitute some of the earliest histories of the American Revolution as well as of the American Republic, and they were written then by a German-speaking Bohemian in eastern Hungary. Now, sadly, Hungarian scholars, not just Hungarian scholars, but some scholars, assumed that some of these works had been lost, so this was the only one published and the only one preserved. But happily, I found that the other works that he mentioned were kept in the archives in Slovakia to this day. So you can see these two documents show then the works that Zinder completed in 1783 and 1784. They were written by hand, they were never unfortunately published. One of them was written in Latin, his usual university language, of course, at that time, suggesting that he probably used this as notes for his universal history classes, and then the other one is written in his native German. Both these works are rather large. The one on the left, the Notitia Historica de Colonias Americae, the historical notes about American colonies, was around 200 handwritten pages. The other one, the attempt of a war history of the United or Allied States of America, that totaled around 550 handwritten pages. So again, these are extremely extensive histories of America. They go from the beginning of Columbus and the discovery of America to the new republic and its aims. And so the question arises, why did Zinder, who travelled to Paris and back, and who was so moved by the American Revolution to write these enormous works, why did he take that effort? Why did he bother to do that? Well, happily, he wrote why in his letters to Franklin. And I think these two quotes are worth reading out loud, and perhaps it's a good point as well to end on. So he said, "I was born the subject of a great monarch, and under a government whose rule is mild. but I cannot tell you what joy I feel when I hear or read of your progress in America. To speak the truth, I look upon you and all the chiefs of your new republic as angels, sent by heaven to guide and comfort the human race. And to give public manifestation of this sentiment, I am composing this work. And then, several years later, once he completed the second of these 3 works, he wrote again to Franklin, and he indeed dedicated in Latin these following words to the US Congress. He said, "The people of America happily built the Capitol in only 7 years and founded a new and prosperous republic, which is your glory in the New World. This is what amazes all peoples, even the faraway peoples," perhaps a comment to his own Habsburg colleagues. "This is what moves me most, that I pass on your young origin, your tireless work for freedom, and the memory that I record the outstanding public announcement of your fame with writings. Onwards, you most excellent men, your name as an example to my fully devoted vigilance. Follow the counsel of the just and the good, and you will be held by me with the most glorious praise for those who seek renewal." So it could not be clearer. The reason why Zinder, as one of the earliest historians of the American Revolution and of the United States, was moved to write these enormous works, because he was so enamored with the ideas and principles of the American Revolution. And so again, I hope I've made it clear to you not just how the ideas of the American Revolution permeated quite far into the Habsburg lands, but also how its commerce affected those in the Habsburg lands, and how its diplomacy stretches far back until the 18th century as well. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and your patience, and I look forward to the questions.